Hello, my name is Layton. I'm an intuitive and a mystic, and today we're going to be talking about what I like to call planetary anatomy because I think it's fun. We're basically taking the concept of occult anatomy, but we're moving through the spheres, and we are especially looking at the fact that each planet or sphere is actually just a symbolic or materially symbolic representation of an archetype or an impulse that exists within us. These are living forces. The planets are living forces that exist within us. And we have this physical representation of them that we have unfortunately become extremely disconnected from, and we no longer understand the deeper truths of how they work on our nervous system, how we interact with them, what we learn from them. And I found that with that, especially as someone who is highly, highly interested in esoteric or occult anatomy, I didn't really feel like there was enough specifically on this topic. I didn't feel like there was anything, there really isn't anything comprehensive that anyone has pulled together to kind of, and organized to kind of walk through each sphere and talk about how is it impacting the nervous system? How is it impacting the physical body? How is it impacting the will? What do all of these things mean on a deeper level where we can actually take this information and apply it practically in our lives and have it not be something that is so esoteric that it's out of reach. I feel that that's what happens with so much information, and we see this temptation in general within people who study the occult, where it is a highly academic field of study. And so there can almost be this temptation to just accumulate all of this knowledge. And then what are we doing with it? What do we have to show for it? So I really aim to kind of bridge that gap. I don't want these things to be confusing or so out there. I want us to be able to talk about them in a way that is really interesting, because I personally think that this work is beyond fascinating. It fascinates me. In order to put these lectures together in the Planetary Anatomy series, and I've noticed, because I kind of had a general idea when I began with the first one of what I wanted to talk about and what I wanted to incorporate. But as I'm going through the spheres, I'm like, okay, I need to go deeper. I want to pull from here. I want to pull from here. And that will probably continue to happen. I'll probably continue to pull from different places. So my goal here is to really showcase all of this through the lens of Anthroposophy or Western occultism. However, there is overlap with alchemical traditions, overlap a little bit with Eastern mysticism, and there's some overlap with astrology. So I'll try and kind of highlight as we go through. And I also wanted to say that there's a study guide this time. The reason why is because I really am opposed to putting so much effort into putting this together for you guys and having it be something that doesn't permeate. I don't want it to be something that you watch and find interesting in the moment, but then don't know how to apply, or it feels like there's kind of this disconnect, or maybe it's engaging in the moment and then you forget about it. I want there to be something tangible that you can return to, that you can follow along with to kind of help that process, because I genuinely think it is that important. So I'm willing to put in a lot of work to help make this more accessible, because that is genuinely how important I think it is. So getting into Mercury, this one was actually extremely difficult for me, not because the concepts are so out there and so difficult, but because Mercury specifically is so interwoven. And depending on what system you're using, depending on what tradition you're looking at, it is understood so differently. And that's not because these understandings are negating one another, because they really don't. It's that Mercury is just that complex. It works on us in so many different ways. And so we're going to try and talk about that a little bit. And first, I want you to go to the description and just pull up your study guide. So you'll see, and it's going to be available on my website. So if you want to access it again, you aren't necessarily going to have to go to this video and click on the description every time. You can either download it, and I try and make it so that you can download it and print it if you want, or you can just go on my website and type in Mercury and it will come up. So, of course, here we go. It was frozen for a second. Something like that always happens to me every time. So I'm gonna kind of use the study guide as a map to kind of follow along with, because I don't want to get off track, and then if you're following along it becomes kind of confusing, and then I have a lot of notes that we're gonna go from. But to begin, Mercury is the first planet from the sun. Here's why I think that is super fascinating. So you can kind of think of Mercury, it's a mediator first and foremost, but you can also kind of think of it as a funnel. So when we look at the sun, and my first planetary anatomy lecture was on the sun, and so please watch that if you have not already. But when we look at the sun, it is so powerful. The impact that it has on us is beyond transformational, and it is literally this ball of fire. So our inner sun is in the heart, and the goal is essentially to activate that so that those holy fires can burn away anything that is that needs to be transmuted, anything that is unconscious, anything that is karmic baggage, our pain, our trauma, all of these things that would otherwise kind of get mucked up in the lower centers. The goal is for the heart to be like this vacuum that is such a force. It's so powerful that it sucks everything up into that space, and nothing that is not holy survives. But that doesn't mean that it's thrown away. You have all of these lower aspects that in that holy fire begin to be refined and transmuted. And so they are transformed from their lower qualities up into a higher, finer quality. So when we think of how powerful that is, how much heat that would take, when we think of, the destruction that would come of that if it didn't have some sort of stabilizing, balancing force, something to kind of act as a mediator. This is where Mercury comes in. So Mercury, if we have the sun, and then we have Mercury, is kind of this buffer. And but not just a buffer. Mercury is like the translator of solar forces, and just pulls all of those solar forces and allows us to be able to integrate them in very subtle ways. Now, Mercury in general, alongside with being this mediator, it is also an animator. So because it's pulling those higher solar forces into us, it allows us to animate the human physical form, meaning that we have all of these forces and impulses and all of these things that are within us. Well, what's the expression of that? How do we express that? How do we turn that into thought? into will, into speech, how do we take that and make it into an expression? The fact that we can speak, the fact that we can sing, the fact that we can move our limbs, the fact that we can dance, the fact that we can make facial expressions, the fact that we hear something and that translates into not just a sound, but then we can trace that sound back to a source, and then we understand the source. Mercury is like the mechanism behind all of those things. So it's very important that we understand that, and that is why I believe Mercury is the first planet from the sun. So in the study guide I wrote, after receiving transmitted solar forces via mercurial impulses, the nervous system creates living pathways for the ego, or the I, our individuality, to express itself via speech, movement, and sensory experience. So even when we think of ourselves as infants, when all we could do was cry, we didn't really understand what was going on with us, it's because our Mercury forces are actually strengthened and refined over time. They are stabilized over time, which goes into the philosopher's stone, which I'm going to get into in a few minutes. According to Rudolf Steiner, speech is considered an ego activity, and it is where the I comes into contact with the will via embodied action. So if we did not have these mercurial forces, we would not be able to make that connection. I kind of wish that I knew how to do animation, especially as an artist, but honestly, I just don't even have the time to learn it, because I don't know if you guys ever watched Schoolhouse Rock and they had like the awesome visuals and the songs and everything that went along with it, but I kind of have these creative mental videos or animations that will play out in my head when I'm thinking of this kind of thing. And so I think of in Schoolhouse Rock, when they're talking about conjunctions, and they have like a train, I believe, and it's like showing how conjunctions work to link things together. And I kind of have this, I guess, parallel animation going on in my mind about Mercury. Mercury enables the externalization of the inner world. It also acts as a mediator, allowing solar forces to influence the physical body through electrical patterns in the nervous system and rhythmic physiological processes. So what else do I want to cover in that section? I think I talked about all of that. Okay, so here's another thing I should mention. And if you could see my notes, they are never organized. I don't script my videos. My notes are like these schizophrenic ramblings that I just section off, and then I have to kind of scroll through. There's no organizing it. It becomes organized when I write it out or when I speak it out. But if we did not have Mercury, our inner Mercury, because again, the physical planet of Mercury is just this symbolic externalization of a real process, which we see in nature with so many different things. It's kind of like how the etherization of the blood can very easily be seen and understood through photosynthesis and through that process. So when we understand that everything within nature and the cosmos is a reflection of our inner cosmos, everything kind of starts to come together a little bit better. But if we didn't have Mercury's mediation, we would basically be like this ball of pure thought. And it wouldn't even be organized thought. It would more so be like this blinking impulse, and we would have no way to take that and turn it into an expression, or to take that and turn it into an action. It would be like this throbbing will that had no way to actually come into form. And when you think about it, and you think about in the Bible, for example, it says that God spoke and said, "Let there be light." There was some sort of connection between the will that allowed it to express itself, that then brought forth this action, and that manifested as the will manifested, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. So if you go down to where it says in your study guide, if you are following along, but you really don't have to if you don't want to, because you're not going to miss anything. We're going to cover it all either way. I just wanted you to be able to have these resources in case you needed them. But it says Mercury and the philosopher's stone. And the idea of the philosopher's stone is very interesting, because we have this temptation as humans, I think, to take certain concepts that are very esoteric and to make them as dense and material and physical as we can possibly understand it to be, and then to attempt to achieve this certain outcome through this physicalization that completely misses the point. And the philosopher's stone is one such example. So the true purpose of the philosopher's stone is enlightenment. It's gnosis. And yet we have so many people that have just simplified it and densified it and watered it down to the point where there are literally people that think that it's just about precious metals, and they don't actually believe that there's anything beyond that, which is kind of sad. So Rudolf Steiner says about the philosopher's stone, the trained will must rise to the great will that rules the sun and the stars. The philosopher's stone is found through the training of thinking, feeling, and willing, through imagination and inspiration. Alchemy, though often explained in material principles, is not defined by them. Alchemical processes actually refer to the spiritualization of the human form via the transformation of the lower self and lower nature into higher qualities. So this is what I was talking about earlier, and this is what we know to be called the etherization of the blood. So earlier when I was talking about the heart being once activated, becoming this furnace, it is the expression of the sun, that our inner sun alive within us, that in all of its heat and holiness burns to such a degree that anything that comes into contact with that Christ force that is not of Christ is forced into transformation, and it will never be the same. It becomes something beautiful. This is where we hear the term beauty from ashes. We're taking something that was previously dead, something that had nothing left to it, something that had been cannibalized, and we are re-ensouling it, reinvigorating it, fueling it with that Christed force once again, bringing it back to life. So when we are not etherizing the form properly, what happens is that we actually begin to have a reverse effect that I just call reverse etherization, because that's the easiest way to describe it. So instead of etherizing through the heart, which is when everything, like I said, all of that muck, that guck that has just been building up for so long is pulled into the heart furnace, and it begins to go from a lower quality into a higher, finer quality. And then that higher, finer substance begins to permeate our entire system, and it spiritualizes our entire form. But if we don't activate the heart, and we stay in the lower centers. Then the opposite happens, and instead we end up kind of sucking from the heart and sucking from every other spiritual organ, and it's all being pulled into this dark, thick cloud where it's just covered in dust and black goo, and it's like the life is sucked out of it. It's stale, it's old, it's moldy, and it's of no use to us until we activate the heart again. So that is the spiritualization of the human form. This is not just a symbol or an analogy, but represents a real occult process of refining the physical and etheric bodies to serve the development of the higher I and build the resurrection body. So the resurrection body is pretty much the completed form. It's when we have run our system through that process of spiritualization, and to the degree to which there is nothing left to transform. Everything has been transformed. We have released ourselves of all of that density and all of that muck and all of that guck. Clearly, I love those words. And we have transmuted that into such a fine, high substance that at that point is basically glowing. It's also known as the rainbow body for that exact same reason. We surpass the physical form, and the etheric form is just absolutely glorified, and it's glowing, and it is the highest form at this point that we could attain. In classical occultism and alchemical teachings, each sphere corresponds with a metal. This is where alchemy and the philosopher's stone and all of those things come in. This correspondence represents deep spiritual truths that reflect spiritual scientific processes. For example, gold, known as the highest in its refinement and valued for its beauty, corresponds with the sun. The mercurial sphere corresponds with the metal mercury. Mercury, along with salt and sulfur, is part of the trinity of alchemical principles that make up the philosopher's stone. Associations of Mercury alternate between soul, spirit, and intellect depending on individual interpretations across various esoteric traditions and frameworks. But here is how Steiner defines these principles. Sulfur is connected according to its nature with the mind, Mercury with the soul, and salt with the body of the human being. Though Mercury is often associated with intellect in astrology and medical astrology, and this is indeed a correct association, the intellect referred to here is of a much higher nature. The soul represents the ultimate technology of mediation between spirit and matter. This is why it is necessary in order to achieve the purified golden state of the philosopher's stone. So in order to actually achieve the philosopher's stone, which is, again, enlightenment, it's gnosis, we have to have a certain level of stability. The way that we get that stability is through that connection with Mercury, but it has to be a clear signal. So if we think about how Mercury it animates us, it allows us to express ourselves, it helps us to stabilize and express certain forces or impulses. You can then think of the damage that would be done if we have an imbalanced inner Mercury. So we don't have pure thought, pure will, pure feeling. If we're very disconnected from our will, which would happen if we're very fragmented and we're disconnected, we have a fragmented ego, so we're disconnected from the higher I. We don't know who we are, we don't know what our purpose is, we don't know what we're supposed to be doing. That will translate into our thoughts, it will translate into our feelings, it will translate into our senses and the way that we express ourselves And then our inner Mercury can actually invert. And instead of being a vehicle for truth, which if it's mediating solar forces, then that's really what's happening. It's a vehicle for truth. And it takes truth and it makes it mobile. So if it's not doing that, and if we have an inverted inner Mercury, then what's actually happening is that we are expressing deceit. We are expressing falsehoods, which is kind of the same thing, but we do not have clarity. And that's just kind of being circulated within us. So it's making us more fragmented. It's making us more destabilized, and really taking us further away from what actually would bring about any kind of spiritual growth if we were to be balanced in that way. So it impacts our higher reasoning, and if we are imbalanced there. And we wouldn't be able to connect to seeing a higher perspective. We would be disconnected if our inner Mercury is inverted, and that is the vehicle of truth. Then that is also imparting and allowing certain higher solar forces from higher beings to be expressed through us. So if we lose that connection, then we're not having those higher solar forces working on us, because we are closed off to that, unfortunately. And that is what is going to block us off from that higher reasoning. It's going to impact our communication. We won't be able to communicate effectively, and we won't be able to communicate truth. So in astrology and medical astrology as well, you will see a lot of correlations with Mercury and with your speech and communication. I know that my Mercury is in Aries, and it definitely shows. I am an extremely direct and straightforward person, and I love to be that way. I think that it saves a lot of time. I think it's really good to speak your truth, to speak where you stand, in a loving and grounded way. I think it's good to be honest. I think those things are important. So I usually resonate a lot with that and find a lot of strength and boldness in that. And there's a huge difference between the understanding of astrology. I actually have a video where I talk about the difference between planetary anatomy and medical astrology. However, it's still okay to use these parallels to kind of understand how something impacts us a little bit more. So even though medical astrology is not planetary anatomy, and astrology in general is not planetary anatomy, there are still some overlaps, and that is completely okay. So in general, when you think of a balanced Mercury, even if I'm just talking about my Mercury being in Aries, so when it's balanced, that gives me this ability to communicate very clearly and effectively, to speak things that maybe other people may find uncomfortable, but I feel very emboldened in that, and I feel a certain level of courage in that. However, if it was imbalanced, then it would come out as defensiveness, impulsivity in my speech and expression, way too much fire coming through there. So you can even look at how balanced or imbalanced you are by looking at your astrology when it comes to Mercury specifically, because that in pop culture, it's just easily understood, so we can kind of measure things that way. And Mercury's connection to human evolution in general is really interesting, because it sharpens our memory. It kind of brings our memory into form, and then it takes that memory and allows us to animate it and to live it out. So if we have the outer cosmos and then we have an inner cosmos, then we can see each sphere as marking a different stage in our development. And if we understand that, then we understand that the knowledge of each stage of human evolution already exists within us. and that how balanced or imbalanced we are in different areas usually lines up with some sort of trauma or experience or imbalance that comes from a prior epoch. And then once we have an understanding of that, we can go into that and try to work with that inner sphere to find healing and wholeness. I mean, that's really what this is all about. So Mercury also aided in kind of the beginnings, the saplings of our individual thought and individuality. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense, because who are we if we can't express ourselves? We have this individuality, we have this originality, but before we were all operating from this hive mind. We were all kind of moving like reeds in the wind, going the same direction at the exact same time. And so what happens when we begin to have that, like I was saying before, that blinking light impulse? There's something within us that's different, something within us that is longing to be expressed. And suddenly we have the ability to express it. This is what allows us to be individuals. And so we first saw that coming about in the Lemurian epoch, which is it's really not surprising at all. I also wanted to say, and I meant to touch on this earlier and I completely forgot to, because there's so much that we could get into here, but I'm really trying to keep these lectures from just being convoluted and way too long. I don't want to spend all of this time talking in circles on one specific thing, and I 100% could do that. But Rudolf Steiner also links Mercury with Archangel Raphael, and the Sun with Michael, and this is a pattern where each one of our inner spheres it corresponds with a higher being. And it's really interesting too, because in Anthroposophy, there are actually so many times where Steiner will use Raphael or Mercury interchangeably, like there's no difference, like it's the same thing. Like the impulse of Raphael is so embedded within Mercury, and the archetypes of Mercury are so intertwined with the being that is Archangel Raphael. So I think that's really interesting. But then Archangel Raphael is very healing, rules over healing the system. And if you think about it, that ties in perfectly with Mercury as the mediator, because Mercury is funneling all of these higher solar forces into our nervous system, into our being, which, if funneled properly, absolutely bring about healing to the system. Raphael also governs certain rhythms, and especially breathing. So Mercury is also tied to the lungs, but specifically breathing for that purpose. And just another way to clarify why this works and why this is true is, again, the lungs hold and contain the etheric forces. So if we are not breathing, we are not alive, and we are constantly pumping these etheric forces in and out of our bodies. Now, that doesn't mean that that is the only thing that indicates life force within us, because it's not. We also have that in our blood, and there's a level that we have that in our nervous system. However, Raphael governing breathing and the lungs and being one in the same with Mercury. Mercury being a mediator between the most life-giving forces we can imagine and the human form. It makes perfect sense that all of that would be intertwined, that Raphael would govern Mercury, would govern our breathing, and would be that mediator. The lungs are a mediator between the external etheric forces and the internal etheric forces, and we have this exchange that happens, this pumping exchange, where there's this constant communication, if you will. So just to add to that a little bit, to kind of give you a little bit more imagery, and again, you have the function of the lungs. Well, how do we speak? We can't speak without that airflow. All we could do was grunt like cavemen. We wouldn't be able to express ourselves in that way. So I feel actually at this point in the lecture like that meme of the whiteboard guy, and he like has all of this craziness on the whiteboard and he's like looking all crazed at his creation. That is actually how I feel and I hope it comes off smoother than that. But that's how I feel when I'm making all of these connections, because for some reason I realized, I'm studying all of this stuff all the time. Why is this not more organized? Sometimes I feel that way when I'm studying, especially things around occult and esoteric anatomy. And I'm just going to say it, I actually think that the Eastern systems have done a much better job at organizing this than the Western systems. The difference is that we have certain ways of interpreting things, and our timeline is a bit different in a way that impacts things. So we can't just take everything that was said about esoteric anatomy in the Eastern systems and then apply it across the board. We can absolutely look at the parallels, and we can understand that there is so much overlap. But I just think that we need more structure in the Western system. So when we are looking at how to really cultivate our inner Mercury, the very first thing that we can do is work on our connection with the heart, because the heart is where we are actually going to begin to connect to our higher I and bring those solar forces into ourselves. So I feel like a lot of people would expect me to say something like, oh, if you want to cultivate your inner Mercury, you need to focus on the words coming out of your mouth and deepen your physical expression, maybe get into your rhythmy. Things like that are completely fine, but they won't mean anything if we don't have that connection with the heart first. And then alongside that, we also need to have some sort of understanding of the I. We need to defragment the ego. We need to bring wholeness into the system. Now, Mercury translates through our nervous system, because solar forces are, once they come into the heart, they are all dispersed through our nervous system. And so Mercury is like this little carrier that just kind of, almost like a cell phone carrier kind of, that takes the connection and allows it to be received. So what can we do then? We can work on building resilience within the nervous system. Note that I am not saying regulate the nervous system, because regulation will help in the moment, but it will not really give us what we need long term. So we need to build coherence within the nervous system, which I talk about in my 2 latest lectures on mirror work. I have an introductory class, which is really beneficial for understanding coherence, understanding the I, the self versus the not self, and kind of the importance of integration and how to integrate things into our system. And then my second class on that is just a bunch of practices and exercises, because I want everything I talk about, to the best of my ability, to be practical, applicable, measurable. That's like my motto. I think if something doesn't have those things, then it's not a system. It's lacking cohesiveness. It's probably just a bunch of spiritual fluff that is intended to hold someone's attention just long enough to make them feel like it has some sort of substance, and then it just withers. And I just think that the point that we are in the world right now is too pivotal for things like that. So we need to build coherence within the nervous system, which is when every single system within the body is working together as one. It becomes unified, a unified whole. And simultaneously, we want to build resilience, meaning that we can experience difficult, stressful, hard things without fragmenting further. And I'm not talking about emotional resilience, although emotional resilience can absolutely coincide with nervous system resilience. So often people will say, oh, you're so resilient because you've gone through all of these things. But going through all of these difficult experiences does not make someone resilient. They could be completely broken and flayed open and fragmented and lost. Going through hardship does not automatically build resilience. In order for us to build resilience within the nervous system, we have to have some level of safety that creates a container that gives us enough space to be able to recover from whatever the hardship was, even if just a little bit. And then that little bit of recovery begins to build up this resilience. It's kind of like how if I were to just work tirelessly all day, every day without taking a single break, and I'm like plowing the fields, and I'm not allowed to stop to drink water or rest, eventually I'm going to just die. My heart's going to give out. I'm going to die of heat exhaustion. I'm going to die of starvation, all of these things, dehydration, a combination of all of these things. However, if I were to go out and plow for 8 hours a day and then go home, eat a hearty meal, sleep, drink water, and then go out and do it again, eventually I would be built. I would have some crazy biceps, my thighs would be rock solid. And that's building resilience. Instead of just exhausting yourself and forcing yourself with no rest period, you are creating even if it's the tiniest container, just enough to recover so that you can begin to kind of build strength on top of that. But the only way we can do that is if in that container we feel some sense of safety. And I can't get into all of that right now because it would be totally off topic, but I do have other videos on somatics. And even in my video on 5G and EMFs, that would be a really helpful starting point because I go over a lot of different somatic exercises that could be helpful. But to cultivate our inner Mercury, just to kind of recap, we need to connect to the heart, first and foremost. We need to work on resilience within the nervous system. We need to understand ourselves. What is my will? We need to understand the state of ourselves. What is my shadow? What's pulling me away? And what is it pulling me away from? And what is the bridge? How do I bridge this gap? What do I need? We have all these important questions that we need to ask ourselves because Mercury, again, it has an inverted state. Everything does. Every single thing does. And when we are not living in that state of momentum with truth, then we're living out of accordance with truth. We're living in a falsehood. We're living in a lie, essentially. That is nothing to be ashamed of, by the way. If you are in any kind of position where you just don't have control over your environment to be able to build nervous system resilience or any of those things, you don't shame yourself for having this experience. Even just acknowledging it and showing yourself love and grace and compassion for the situation that you're in can go so far. It really, really can. So we really just want to redeem our inner Mercury. And once we get to a certain point, that is when we can begin to refine our thoughts, refine our feeling, refine our will. That would have to be a whole other video. But Mercury is either the pathway to ascension or it's our downfall. It's our choice. And that is said individually and collectively. What are we going to do with this expression now that we have it? And again, in order to have that expression the way it was intended, it needs to be in alignment with these higher forces. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to receive from them. Our reception will be cut off, and it will be turned elsewhere. We won't be able to receive those healing forces. So again, Mercury is the bridge through which the spirit can fully inhabit the body. I think that is really beautiful. I think that is really powerful. I hope you do too. I hope you think more about some of these things. I would love to hear your opinion, your thoughts, your feelings about it. Let me know what you think about the study guide. And I also want to say that in general, you can expect that for me, I'll say for 99% of lectures, I'm aiming for 100%, but I want to have study guides and workbooks and things like that. I want it to be readily available. It's really important to me, actually, that I find any way that I can to make this work as accessible as possible. So definitely keep an eye out for that in the future. Thank you so much for being here with me, and I'm excited for the next one. Hopefully it won't take me quite as many months, but you know, sometimes it takes longer, and I like to think that it's worth the wait. Love you guys.